The North Korean leader Kim Jong Un is holding talks with President Vladimir Putin in the far east of Russia. They met at the Vostochny Cosmodrome space center. Putin said North Korea was interested in rocket technology to develop its own space program. The two leaders will also expect to discuss the supply of ammunition by North Korea to Russia, which is running short of supplies for its invasion of Ukraine. Now, this is Kim Jong Un's first foreign trip since the pandemic. Yun Shin is a reporter and news anchor with South Korea's Arirang TV, and she joins us now from the capital, Seoul. Welcome to DW. Let's talk about location, first of all. Now, this meeting was originally reported to take place in Vladivostok. It's actually, though, now happening at a cosmodrome, a Russian space centre, isn't it? Can you tell us what the significance of that might be?
Right, the Vostochny space launch facility is in Russia's far eastern Amur region, and this spaceport is some 1,000 kilometers from Vladivostok, where many experts and media outlets first speculated the top summit to take place, given that it was where the two leaders met back in April of 2019. Also, it was where Vladimir Putin was at last participating in the Eastern Economic Forum. And going back to your question as to why it's significant that a Russian space center has been chosen as their first meetup location in years, well, it's because that it suggests that Russia may help North Korea with its rocketry and satellite programs. And Pyongyang has recently failed to put its own military spy satellite into orbit. So if Moscow were to share its satellite technology, North Korea would be able to strengthen with its military capabilities. And this is likely the scenario we'll be seeing, because a Russian news agency also reported Putin saying upon his arrival how his North Korean counterpart Kim Jong Un shown great interest in rocket technology and expanding the regime's presence in space. Putin also said he and his North Korean counterpart will talk about a wide array of relevant issues without haste specifically here, so we'll have to see what type of breakthroughs will be mentioned, but most likely in regards to military cooperation.
All right. Now, just hours before Kim arrived for the meeting, as he was on his way, North Korea fired 2 ballistic missiles towards the sea. What message is Pyongyang trying to send here, would you say?
As you mentioned, there were 2 ballistic missiles launched towards the sea without Kim Jong Un even being in the country, and that's quite worrisome, because here in Korea, we're taking it as a security threat. Experts are mainly worried that if Kim and Putin were to agree to strengthen their military cooperation in this type of geopolitical tension, we could also be seeing a possible 3-way naval drill with China, and that was already mentioned before in July. And as you mentioned, the physical military threats have already been seen just hours ahead of the summit. North Korea fired 2 short-range ballistic missiles, and Seoul's Joint Chiefs of Staff said the 2 missiles were launched at 11:43 a.m. and 11:53 a.m. today, Korea time, both flying some 650 kilometers each from North Korea's Sunan region. And now South Korean authorities are definitely on the lookout in full readiness stance, because they are now closely cooperating with the United States to see what can be happening forward, especially during the talks with Kim Jong Un and Putin.
OK, so those talks are happening now. The two leaders are talking with their delegations, we're told. Who has Kim brought with him?
Kim has brought his top military officials with him. The delegation includes military officials, Lee Byung-chul and Park Jung-cheon, and that just shows that military cooperation is a top agenda, which is why a lot here in Seoul are quite worried about what will be discussed. As I mentioned a few times before, there's high possibility that information regarding satellite technology and especially submarine nuclear technology are the key agendas, because those are 2 things that North Korea has been asking for in the past.
OK, and how worrying is this meeting for South Korea? What's the reaction there?
I think it's quite worrying, because sanctions don't seem to be as effective in stopping North Korea or Russia from doing what the international society is telling them not to do. But we've been seeing Washington and Seoul continuously refer to the UNSC Council resolutions. We've been talking about sanctions and how Washington will not refrain. They won't hesitate to slap even more sanctions. But will this stop them from actually finding breakthroughs in military cooperation is a complete different issue. And some experts has told me that it's inevitable that Russia and North Korea will forge higher level cooperation on the military front. As I mentioned before, it seems like the two pariah states need each other the most at the moment. Ever since Pyongyang failed to find a middle ground with Washington, in its nuclear summit, it's been suffering with multilateral sanctions, which of course affected its economy. And the pandemic exacerbated North Korea's food and energy crisis. Russia is no exception when it comes to being heavily sanctioned. So because the internationally outcasted two countries now need each other the most, this is worrying. This is very worrisome for countries like Korea. And recently we've come back from a Camp David trilateral summit with Washington and Tokyo. So we've been bolstering ties. And Beijing, North Korea, and Russia, for them to bolster ties, this could definitely affect the geopolitical security here in the Korean Peninsula and nearby.
OK, and finally, just sort of looking forward, you know, Seoul has so far held back from sending weapons to Ukraine. If Kim were to strike a deal with Putin to provide munitions for Russia's war in Ukraine, could that then potentially change for Seoul?
I think we'll still have to see because South Korea is definitely put in a relatively difficult position. We are still a partner country with Russia. We still have exchanges going on. And South Korea's presidential office mentioned a few days ago, it actually asked Russia, a permanent member of the UNSC, to act responsibly. And Seoul also referred to how any arms deal between North Korea and Russia would yet again violate a long list of UN sanctions. We'll still have to see what comes forth. But at the moment, that's the presidential office's stance. It's asking Russia to be a responsible permanent member of the UNSC.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. But thank you so much. That's Yun Shun from South Korea's Arirang TV. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
From Cambridge, Massachusetts, I'm joined now by Dr. John Park from the Korea Project at the Harvard Kennedy School. Good to have you with us. I want to start by asking, what do Russia and North Korea want from each other?
Yeah, it's a unique relationship right now. They have the opportunity to help each other in solving very specific problems. In the case of Russia, Putin has the ability to access artillery shells that the North Koreans are having in their inventory and other munitions for the battlefield. In the case of North Korea, Kim is able to get the Russian assistance that he needs in terms of getting his space launch vehicle program to the next stage and eventually putting a satellite into orbit. A little over a year ago, the Russians helped Iran in terms of putting their Kayam satellite into orbit. And so a very similar type of case study could play out here in terms of Russia-North Korea cooperation.
Does it appear to you that the threat of more sanctions from Washington has much of an effect on how North Korea and Russia do business at this point?
So if you look at it, both countries, both regimes have been heavily sanctioned in terms of what to anticipate. They're very experienced in that space. And so with the threat of potential additional sanctions applied to Russia and North Korea, I think these are things that are built into the calculation by both regimes. So from that perspective, a deterrent capability of additional sanctions applied to Moscow and Pyongyang, they're likely to have limited impact in terms of influencing the decision-making, the calculus of these two leaders.
So with that in mind, if they move forward on this process, what does this budding relationship mean then for the rest of the world and for Ukraine?
So if you look at it from the perspective of some of the statements that Putin has been making, it really is a war of attrition, and his view that he is in a stronger position in terms of waiting out the democratically elected governments in the West that are supporting the Ukrainians on the battlefield. So for the U.S. to continue providing weapons and ammunition at the speed of war, this is something that from a Putin type of calculation, the longer this plays out in the United States and Putin hoping for fatigue of some kind, being able to draw on Russian sourced and very similar types of armaments from the North Korean side gives him that upper hand in terms of, from his calculation, of a war of attrition. On the North Korean piece of it, this partnership, again, helps in terms of key areas where the North Koreans have had stumbling blocks. They've tried twice now with their space launch vehicle tests. Both have failed. And there's a critical element in terms of getting to the next stage of advancing not only their space launch vehicle program, but also their ICBM program. So there's a unique type of partnership here that doesn't bode well in terms of international security.
Great to get your input, Dr. John Park from the Harvard Kennedy School. Many thanks.
Thank you.